Greetings and welcome to IT SPARC Cast Top 10. I'm your host, John Barger.
And I'm your host, Lou Schmidt. Let's get to the countdown.
In the IT SPARC Cast Top 10, we go through the top 10 things, events, or people in a specific category. We then give you the details that you might not know with insights, opinions, and a little sarcasm from two experts, each with over 20 years experience working in IT or for IT vendors.
And let's have some fun with this one because John and I actually lived through most of this.
In today's episode, we're counting down the top 10 biggest operating system flops of all time. So this should be a lot of fun.
Oh.
Starting with number 10, should be no surprise to anybody, Windows ME from Microsoft, circa 2000.
Ugh.
So Windows 2000 ME was a follow-up to a very popular Windows 98. And Windows 98 was the follow-up to Windows 95. And Windows 98 was really a feature pack for Windows 95. It got everything really shorn up, got all the drivers right, and then they broke it. Windows ME was criticized for stability issues. It frequently crashed, and it earned the moniker Mistaken Edition. When it really stood for Millennium Edition, it was known as the Mistaken Edition because it was really that bad. And honestly, I skipped ME. I was running Windows 95 and then Windows 98. I held on to 98 and I moved to its follow-up, which was Windows XP when that came out. And
what was the fallout?
So the fallout is that everybody out there upgraded to Windows XP. And I feel that Microsoft did the right thing with Windows XP because Windows XP was not an evolution of the Windows 95, 98 ME train. Windows XP was actually an evolution of the Windows NT 2000 train. It actually had the kernel from NT. And that, I think, was really the right direction for them to go. If you think about it, Windows 95, 98, and ME were really evolutions of Windows 3.0, which was really a shell on top of DOS.
On top of DOS, yes.
Matter of fact, one of my favorite sayings, and I'm going to see if I can get this right, was that Windows was a 32-bit port of a 16-bit shell on top of an 8-bit operating system written for a 4-bit processor by a 2-bit company that couldn't stand 1 bit of competition.
And I think we'll leave it at that. But I will say this was one of the rare failures. But that said, Windows XP, what came after it, is still running in some places.
Windows XP was rock solid. And this is not the last time Microsoft's going to show up on this, but let's move on to our next entry.
Let's talk about number 9, which was HP Palm webOS, which was in 2009. It was Palm and Hewlett-Packard. And what came before it was Palm OS, which was actually fairly sparse. And why it failed is it failed to reach critical mass and beat BlackBerry. At that point, we were just starting to inch into the iOS era and the Android era. Everything was starting up. Palm OS was still somewhat well regarded, but BlackBerry had kind of taken over the business community. And out comes this new thing, this new webOS thing. And it didn't work out real well. So it wasn't that it was bad. It just didn't get critical mass. However, what came after was really interesting. HP open sourced webOS and then sold it to LG. And if you got an LG television, it's in your television right now. And it's actually pretty good. It's basically a nice web interface over Linux. And I would say the fallout was Android and iOS came around and dominated everything.
This one has a special bit of pain in my heart. I was a big Palm user. I had the very original Palm Pilot. I remember going to the store and buying it and then sitting down with a little stylus. I remember writing notes in meetings with a little stylus. I had a Palm 3. I had a Palm 5. I got a special cradle for my Palm 5 that gave me, it wasn't even technically cellular service. It gave me service through, I think it was the UPS network. And I was a big, huge fan. And then it just all went right down the toilet. And I blame HP. I blame HP for a lot of things in general.
You can blame HP for a lot of things. HP probably screwed up your favorite dinner or your dessert or whatever. HP has sort of the opposite of the Midas touch and stuff
Absolutely.
like this. But yeah, it was a shame, but hey, it lives on at least. Now, you know something? I didn't even remember this one. So why don't you go to the next one?
So our next one is also Windows, but it's Microsoft Windows RT from 2012. So many people don't realize this, but Microsoft made a valiant effort to release Windows on ARM back in 2012, and it failed famously or infamously, if you want. And what it really was they wanted to bring out these low-cost, low-powered devices that ran Windows, that they provided more control through their version of an app store. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like something that another technology company that maybe has a fruit-based name might have been doing recently? Well, so Microsoft had been seeing what Apple had been doing with the iPad and the iPhone and wanted to cash in with that. The problem is the world wasn't ready for it. The developers out there didn't believe that their applications could be ported to a little itty bitty ARM-based processor, which today some of the most powerful PCs and laptops in the world, including several that are in this room right now, are running. And Microsoft jumped the gun. They were too early to market. And then, so what happened is that they really gave up on it until Apple proved that it could be done. And they built a proper translation protocol so that you could translate those x86 applications to run on those ARM processors. And then when they proved that it could be done, Microsoft came back out with Windows 11 for ARM, and then it started to work. And now you're seeing ARM-based Windows 11 systems show up and flourish, and they're actually doing well. And now you can actually run those same ARM-based applications even on your ARM-based Mac in virtualization. You can run them out there. This is something that's starting to succeed, and you're now starting to see those super thin, light, low power consuming devices out there. And I think that you're going to see more of it.
So the fallout is we're starting to see an ecosystem grow up around ARM because enough people have adopted the platform. Yeah.
The fallout was a delay. They were just too early to market. They had to wait, and then once the market was proven, then they came out and actually are starting to make hay and actually.
It'll be very interesting to see the new noises around the RISC-V, the RISC-V stuff. So, because some folks are seeing some limitations in the ARM architecture, or whizzing contests over who's licensing who. So it'll be very interesting to see where that follows.
Competition's always great, and we are seeing a lot of licensing related issues around ARM and concerns about ARM as a company. And RISC-V is really another play out there. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, it really is.
So what's next, Lou?
Let's talk about number 7. Number 7 is Lindows Linspire that came out in 2001, Lindows Inc. And what came before was Windows and other brands of Linux. So the whole idea behind this thing was that you were going to buy this Linux thing that was less expensive than Windows, and you were going to get all the advantages of Linux and Windows. Well, what ended up happening was that they monkeyed with it enough that it wasn't quite as good a Linux experience as other stuff. And at that point, we were all rolling our own anyway, right? The Windows emulation layer wasn't good enough. And it failed because it was touted as a Windows replacement that could run Windows apps, but it's always hit or miss when you're trying to duplicate Microsoft, right? They're very inconsistent. So what's interesting is after they released it, it bounced around a bit, but it still exists.
Yeah.
I was really surprised. You put this on. I would consider this to be not a big commercial success, but there is still a company out there that is making this thing, and it's now called linspirelinux.com. And it looks like what they do is they sell an integrated wine and VirtualBox solution to folks who have computers that can't make the upgrade to the latest version of Windows. This is where Microsoft's really shooting itself in the foot, because if you're a nonprofit, you're a school, you're a government agency, you don't have budget for new computers, you can't run Windows 11. But You had a point as well. So they're still
Yeah.
out there. You can still buy it. But there's one other thing that came out that I think was really interesting.
If you're a gamer, I would say that the natural evolution of this is Steam OS. So if anybody's used the Steam Deck, or now you can actually use the Steam OS, you can actually download it, install it on almost any semi-modern PC that's got a decent graphics card. Say anything that's 5-10 years old, you could probably run Steam OS on it and actually run a lot of Windows games. And their games are being validated on Steam OS these days. And that's a really interesting way to do this. What's funny to me about this is there's a truckload of effort by so many different people who, including myself, who are looking for ways to run Windows applications or Windows games without having to run Windows. And it's just really funny. There's this, it's like I want all these things that run on Windows, but I don't run on Windows. There's this like level of either hatred or disdain or whatever you want to call it. I actually have a Windows handheld. So I can play Windows games and things like that on this handheld. And I look at it and then I go, I pick up my iPad or I pick up my Mac. And I'm actively working now on ways to run through crossover or other means to run Windows games on my son's Mac or my Mac so that we can do that instead of getting and running Windows. It's just funny the way we do this. Why don't you bring us over to number 6?
I will take you to number 6, and this one is a really fun one. So number 6 is BeOS by B Inc. in 1995. And those are the folks who are following this from home. It basically split out of a former Apple exec that was working on a project to replace Mac OS. And yes, we will speak more about this. And came up with this thing called BeOS. Actually, I had tried it, and it was actually a fairly nice effort. I think what really happened was that because they targeted PowerPC clones first, there wasn't enough installed base for this thing to get any traction. So no developers showed up. Nobody wanted to port over from open source side because it was easier just to run a BeOS skin on top of X Windows. Then you can still get those, by the way. So what happened is eventually it was acquired by Palm, and it was used in an attempt at a new system called Palm OS Cobalt, which sort of spun in. And then it bounced around a bit as intellectual property, and then it became open source somewhat. There's still pieces of it that are locked up, but some people were able to reverse engineer it enough that there is now an operating system called Haiku, which is built on top of Linux, that is available in an active development. So if you want to go use this thing, you can go use it for free. But I would say all the money that they put into this, they flush down the toilet.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Hold your nose for the next one. Can you bring us in here?
And we promised there would be a lot of Windows on here. And here we go again. Number 5, Windows Phone 2010. So this one there's a little bit of a love-hate on this one. So let's get through this. So what came before Windows Phone 2010? There's a few different things. First, Windows CE. And I'll be open and honest, I actually owned several phones that ran the Windows CE operating system. And I had a couple of devices that ran the Windows CE operating system. Also before that, you had Windows Phone 7 and Windows Phone 8. The Metro interface that came out with Windows Phone was actually pretty usable on the phone. Didn't really work as well on the desktop, I don't think. And that's a whole nother discussion to be had. But from an interface standpoint, I feel that it worked. It was really probably around 2010 where the operating system really became usable on the phone, but they were too late to market. The developers didn't believe in it. Apple and Android had really started to dominate. And realistically, there's probably only room for 2 major players in the mobile space. And we keep seeing this. Others try to move in. We saw, Samsung try to move in with their own operating system. We saw BlackBerry fall away. We've seen all these others try to come in and play in the market and just not make it. I think the market has proven that you could have 2 major players in the mobile space, and the Windows Phone was just a casualty of that. It actually, at the end, was actually a pretty good operating system. It just didn't have enough support, and it just fell by the wayside.
What I'm sorry, what came after was Microsoft completely ceded the mobile OS space.
They did.
They just dropped out. And one of the reasons for this, I was going to comment on, is that the upgrade experience from Windows Phone 7, Windows Phone 8 to Windows Phone 10 was a freaking dumpster fire. Yeah. From what I saw. I mean, at that point, I was on Android because I'm a Linux guy. Give me a Linux kernel, right? Arr, arr, arr. But I was blown away by how badly they screwed that up.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, having now been on a Mac for a long time, the whole process of installing Windows has always been a little weird. And moving to Mac, I was like, that's it? You just drag it over? That's it? And that brings us to number 4, Apple Copland. Wait a minute.
Apple did that ever really launch?
And it's Apple. They do everything right. So between 1994 and 1996, Apple realized that their macOS operating system was getting very long in the tooth, having been drug along through various architectures, and really was really showing its age, and they needed to refresh. And they had gone through a lot of mismanagement. Steve Jobs was already gone. They got really over ambitious. They had a really wide product line, and they had lots of pressure coming in from the market. And at the end of the day, and I'm reading a note directly from what Lou wrote in here, is you don't get excellence from a committee that doesn't have a direction.
You're not going to get excellence from a committee anyway, but give me a committee with no directions, and all you're going to get is a lot of expense reports.
And so this was right around the time after Mac OS 7, and they were looking for that next generation of operating system. And so what came next was they acquired Next and the Next OS. And Next OS was ported into what eventually became OS X, which after many years was renamed Mac OS.
Back to Mac OS, right?
What is new is old again, or what is old is new again, however you want to look at that. And so the fallout of that is that while Copland never actually saw a public release, that failure had such severe consequences. Many people at the executive level and below got fired. There was so much engineering effort that was spent and wasted, and finances got to the point that when they eventually did acquire Next and brought Steve Jobs in as an interim CEO, they were months away from insolvency, and they're just barely holding on. And it took somebody like Steve Jobs to come in and really just start cutting everything that wasn't absolutely necessary, cutting all these different product lines, simplifying the product lines, and then really getting that next generation out and bringing the company back from practically a crater. And that's what was required from there. And at the end, they ended up better for it. And, it was just one of those exercises that they needed to go through.
It was really, really touch and go for a while there. I remember after they brought Jobs back and Jobs took over as the CEO again, their stock, well, you wanted to buy their stock then, right? But, there were stories about him going hiking with Michael Dell telling him to shut the company down and give the money back to the shareholders. It was that close. And I grew up in Appletown, right? Yeah. And I watched this whole thing from right in front of me with friends who were working at Apple and seeing the impact on the Valley. It was really that close. It really was. A lot of people don't realize how close Apple came to going out of business. So Copland, stuff like this, most people have now sort of gone, either you're going to get an operating system off the shelf, and these days you're going to get Unix, right? Linux, Unix, Mac OS, it's all Unix now. Unix 1, right? It'll be very interesting to see if somebody follows this up with something new. I saw similar perilous efforts in other companies that were trying to develop new operating systems that would rule them all. This was probably, if you were in the Valley, you watched Pink, which was with IBM. You watched all this other stuff happen, and it was just failure after failure after failure.
Well, why don't you raise a cup of coffee to number 3?
Raise a cup of coffee to number 3. I'll raise my curiously non-logoed water here. Number 3, failure, is Sun, sort of with a bit of IBM in there, JavaOS. So back in 1996, Sun invented this new thing called Java. And the cool thing, the cool kids were going to use Java because Java was just in time compiled. So you could write these programs, and without having to go through this huge stinking process, you would run this on a real-time compiler, which could easily be ported between architectures. So if you're running on, the Solaris chips, you were running on x86, you were running on PowerPC, this was going to be the one ring that ruled them all. So they came out with these JavaOS Java stations, which are everywhere now, right?
Yeah.
No. Okay. Why? What happened? Well, they targeted the business thing, which meant you had to have Solaris servers in the background. Solaris servers weren't cheap, right? So this was supposed to replace SunOS Solaris on the presentation layer, but you were supposed to buy a whole bunch of SunOS Solaris stuff in your back room, right? So what does this sound like if you're a sophisticated computer user? Sounds like X Windows, doesn't it? Multi-user login to a mainframe, except you're running stuff in your local, which means it's faster, right? No. Java has never been accused of being a high-performance system. So that was what really killed it, and it had a very weak ecosystem. So what was interesting, the fallout of this, though, is that Sun sort of stepped back to Solaris and that environment, which would be X Windows, because the cost of high-performance hardware was just doing this, right? They bet their money that high-performance hardware was going to continue to be expensive. Intel came out there and kicked over their house. And more to that, so did Microsoft with Windows NT derivatives down the line. They turned out to be quite good, but they went back to an X Windows world. And ultimately, Sun was acquired by Oracle, but parts of the JavaOS runtime are still around here and there, right? Yeah. Running in embedded devices, industrial stuff. But I would argue what really killed it was that Linux got really good. You could connect to a Solaris box with a Linux box really easily.
The vision of Java as a programming language, I think, was a great vision of the cross-platform run anywhere, right? Once run anywhere. But yeah, I tell you what, even 14 years ago, I ended up getting a job 14 years ago, and I sat down and I had to do an expense report, and the system was running Java, and I just looked at it, and then I felt that I was looking at a 20-year-old interface. And I was just, and it was just, and I had to make sure I was using a very specific browser, and I had just like all these things. And then I had to like go download the right JREs. And I was just like, oh my God, like what planet am I living on? And, and then today I'm on X and I see people talking about Java being, this great development environment.
Well, JavaScript is still a thing.
JavaScript and Java are very different.
Very different, but JavaScript is still a thing.
I'm hearing people talk about Java, not JavaScript. And I understand JavaScript being what it is, and I'm a fan of JavaScript. Java and JavaScript are different, but I still hear people singing the praises of Java. I want to hear what you guys think. Feedback at itsparkcast.com or hit me up on X. Do you think that Java, not JavaScript, but Java is a modern, appropriate development environment today? If you are starting a brand new project from scratch, not a legacy environment in some financial situation, or if you're working on an old Oracle app, I'm going to make a statement. I'm making a statement. Java is what COBOL was 20 years ago.
I'm not going to fight that one.
Bullshit. That's what.
By the way, everybody.
How do I feel about that?
Basically, if you had a Java app, you're porting it to HTML5.
Right. I'm going to move on.
HTML5 and all right, you should do that because we have a new source of pain for you in number 2. Give us number 2.
You're going to get 2 for 1 in number 2 because we're picking 2 operating systems, and we're coming back to Microsoft. Windows 1 and Microsoft Windows 2, released in 1985 and 1987, respectively. So honestly, these, in my mind, were prototypes. These were never intended to be major operating systems. As a matter of fact, they weren't operating systems. They were shells that ran on top of MS-DOS. MS-DOS was the predecessor, and MS-DOS is what you used before this. You would put in your floppy, or you'd boot from your hard drive, you'd come to command line. Maybe you would get a menu, a custom menu systems that was designed if you were running in a custom environment. You type, dir C:, or whatever it might be, and that's how you would navigate before this. This was a very rudimentary, really barely graphical interface that let you click around and do some things. They were looking at trying to duplicate what was going on with the Mac and what trying to like catch up there. I really do feel that what this was their first prototype for what a graphic user interface should look like. I don't feel that this was an attempt to really catch the market. It was slow. There was really no overlapping of windows. It was just tiling of windows. It was really not a usable system, speaking specifically of the 1.0 version. And even as they started to get to 2.0 and started getting some more advanced features, it really wasn't anything compared to what you were getting. And even then, if you looked at what the Mac was compared to today, that was pretty rudimentary, but it was light years ahead of what you were getting from Microsoft. But then Microsoft released Windows 3.0 and then eventually 3.1, which added some really key features. And then they released Windows for networking, which added some really key features. Then that was a game changer. They took off. That was like the big change for Microsoft. Microsoft was no longer MS-DOS and applications. Microsoft was an operating system company. They were out there. And surprisingly, we keep talking about the fallout of all these different pieces. There was surprisingly little fallout. I don't feel that Microsoft lost a lot of money or lost market share for what happened with Windows 1 and Windows 2. What I was really saying is I think that Windows 1 and Windows 2 were training wheels for what really were their efforts to really go into Windows 3.0, and spoiler alert, what they were really working on as well for what we're going to go into with number 1. We're not going to talk about what that is yet, but that really helped them nail it for both the interfaces and what those two operating systems could do. And so I actually feel that the failures of Windows 1 and Windows 2 led to the success of Windows 3.0 and beyond.
I'm gonna dispute that, because the problem, there was Windows 1 and Windows 2, which I never played with. Windows 3 came out, it was still kind of because you were still jumping onto the command line a lot to actually get anything done. But I will tell you what saved Windows, why Windows was a thing, was Windows 3.1. Windows 3 was, people were using it, but it was still, you were loading a single application at a time. Hard drives were still expensive, but Windows 3.1 arrived at a very, very nice place when the web was created, right? And they initially wobbled off. Microsoft said, oh, this web thing isn't going to be anything. You're all going to buy Encarta. We're going to control all your information. And that was just when CD-ROMs were becoming a thing. Also, you had the whole concept of, to get on the internet initially, first you had to navigate the dreaded WinSock DLL.
Yeah.
Right. You had to get WinSock. You had to get a connection from somebody, which was pretty tough then. The number one, if I remember correctly, the number one public service was AOL, and it was primarily targeted at Macs, right? But here comes the web. And once they got the networking stuff sorted, and you got the original Netscape browser, right? Yep. Before Microsoft came out with their browser, but eventually they did. Boom, suddenly everybody wanted Windows, because there was now a reason to be graphical.
There was.
But let's talk about the one that hurts.
Yeah, Lou, bring us home with number 1.
Number 1, although John and I had a heated discussion about whether or not this should have been Copland. But I would argue, you could go either way. Number 1 is IBM OS 2, and this one hurts. And why? Because what came before with Microsoft with PC-DOS which was basically their version of DOS that they licensed from Microsoft. IBM launched OS2 in 1987 with IBM and Microsoft, and the whole idea is this was going to be compatible, right? And it had the full graphical user interface, it had the command line if you needed it, and it failed to compete with Windows. It never gained significant market share in user space, though, which is a really interesting, it is a distinction I'd like to make, because I'm going to tell you something you may not know. So the lesson was, who controls the software controls the market. IBM said, hey, we've got the hardware, we're working with Intel. IBM made its own motherboards. It wasn't until after the PS2 and stuff, I don't know how many of you knew this, but you could start up an IBM PC, and at startup in BIOS mode, hit a button and go directly into BASIC.
Yeah.
Direct. You didn't even need an operating system. You could run your programs directly on the BIOS.
Well, that was a throwback to some of the older systems like the Commodore and the Ataris. And back then, they all could do that as well.
Yeah, but basically, why did it fail? It failed because Microsoft wanted it to fail. They never ported their applications to it.
OS2, you could really make a very, very strong argument that OS2 was a far superior operating system to Windows at the time. It was true multitasking. It was prettier. It had a better looking interface. And just in so many different ways, it was a better interface and a better operating system. It actually was an operating system, whereas Windows was a shell on top of DOS. But also Microsoft came out with Microsoft Word and Excel. And which platforms did they come out with on that first? Windows.
Yes, and that was another thing that drove Windows 3.1.
Yes.
Which was interesting. At that point, if you wanted a good word processor, you went to WordPerfect. But Windows, Word, and Excel started coming out and displacing Lotus 1-2-3 and displacing WordPerfect, which were primarily designed to be driven on a single stream experience. Now, the interesting thing is, it did follow. The fallout of this was IBM spent over $1 billion on this. So we consider that a failure. We don't know how much Apple spent on Copland and the previous efforts. We know it was a lot. They almost crashed the company.
It was almost everything they had.
Almost everything they had. But this one was bad because this is basically took, IBM really never got back into the operating system business after this, which was a shame because they had some really neat stuff. What was interesting, though, is a lot of high reliability loads, machines like ATMs out there running OS2. They weren't really starting to swap those out until 2010. And a lot of those are being replaced basically by Linux machines. It was just so disappointing because of the sabotage and the amount of pain we got dragged through, because a company that would have been better off as an application company still tries to keep a lock on operating systems.
Well, that's going to cover this episode. We couldn't do this podcast without listeners like you, and we'd love to hear what you think. Did we miss an operating system on this list? Should Windows Vista or Windows 8 have been on this list? We had plenty of Windows on here, but should we have had more? Do we have too many versions of Windows on this list?
We didn't talk about Amiga or...
You know what? We will go ahead and do a runners-up list of things that maybe didn't quite make the list. We had a big, long list of things that we'll go ahead and make that video as well. Do you have a different topic you want us to cover? A different top 10 list we should investigate? Send email to feedback@itsparkcast.com. That's feedback at itsparkcast.com, or hit us up on X at IT SPARC Cast. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can also leave comments down below. We read every single piece of feedback we get, and we respond to almost every single one. Be sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. That's really going to help us grow. And if you feel that you're getting value out of us, if you feel that we're being entertaining and we're providing you with what you're looking for, tell your friends, tell your colleagues about us so they can get the same information that you're getting. With that, we're going to go ahead and let you go. Until next time, from the world of enterprise IT, take care.
Thanks for stopping by.